We will now begin Federal Government Unit 2, which will include public opinion, political socialization, political parties, and interest groups. Let us first talk about public opinion. Public opinion, let's get a definition. Public opinion is the collected attitudes of citizens concerning a given issue or question. The key word here is collected. Collected attitudes. It's not Public opinion is not necessarily concerned with the opinion of one person. What they do is they cumulatively put together all the opinions of individual persons and create a, a general idea of what the public as a whole thinks. And this is very important for politicians and political scientists and sociologists and people that study society and what society wants and needs. So public opinion is important, especially for politics. Now, opinion is often varied when it comes to public opinion. You can have extremes on both ends. You can have, uh, very, very divergent opinions on whatever issue it might be. And the problem is, a lot of the opinions people have, it's based on either bad knowledge or lack of knowledge. That often is because of that's why the opinions are varied so much. People's knowledge is different of an issue than other people's. Somebody that is well informed on an issue may have one opinion on that issue. Those that are not as well informed or have uh, bad information or wrong information and shape their opinion based on that are going to have a different opinion. Uh, Many people are uninformed. The information they get regarding an issue is simply wrong. And I know it from my personal experience and probably from most of your personal experiences. Oftentimes you get bad information from people you trust. I know I look back at some of the things my parents told me as a child growing up, just about life in general, and it was generally wrong. They were trying to protect me by telling me things were a certain way, uh, but once I faced real life, I realized that what my parents were telling me were wrong, and I feel like today, as an adult now, that they did a disservice by not telling me the truth. But I understand that they were trying to protect me by um, telling me, misinforming me in order to shape me, I guess, if you will. But people are uninformed, people are misinformed. So that where the key to whether you have a valid opinion and what your opinion might be, a lot of it has to do with where you get your information. And you can get bad information from, like I said, your parents, your peers, your family. You can also get bad information from the media. The media is notorious for skewering and, uh, uh, and not being objective with their information and news reporting because they have an agenda, either a political agenda or some other type of agenda in order to persuade you to believe one way or another. So we must be diligent in ensuring that the information we get is valid. Characteristics of public opinion. Some things to think about when we talk about this. Public attitudes can vary over time, often dramatically. Uh, One of the most historically consistent uh, issues on which people's attitudes change over time is war. Uh, Generally, at the beginning of any war that the United States fights, public opinion is strongly in favor of the war. Of course, there's reasons for that. No lives have been lost yet. No money has been spent, and the government is using all of its resources to promote through the media the necessity of the war. So people buy into it. We become patriotic. We are supportive of the effort. But as wars progress, as they inevitably do, and they last longer and longer, years and oftentimes decades, such as the Afghanistan war, public opinion changes. People do not support the war as much. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially the war in Afghanistan, was generally very popular when it began in 2000 and I guess that would be 2002, late 2001. But Now, most people are not in support of that war in Afghanistan, and they'd argue it's time for us to get out. They feel like it is not worth the blood and the treasure. That's a great example of how over time public opinion can change. Uh, Public opinion may place boundaries on policy. Um, we allow our government to kind of move across the political spectrum as it wishes, from liberal to conservative, from policy to policy, and we hold them accountable by elections. But oftentimes they'll go too far to one extreme or the other, and if public opinion becomes such that it is vehemently against whatever trajectory policy is taking, that will check them usually, and they'll rein it in because they don't want to threaten an uprising against the government and potentially a revolution. That's a civil rights movement's a good example where public opinion forced forced the federal government to place limits on states' rights to discriminate. Government often responds to public opinion. Uh, they'll listen to public opinion. It's important because, of course, the public is who elects the government officials making the policy. But government sometimes does not do what the people want, and I think we recognize that on a daily basis, that the government isn't necessarily responsive to the will of the people all the time, although it is some of the time. Now, how do we measure public opinion? How do we know what people are thinking? Uh, well, first of all, the most common way to measure public opinion is a public opinion poll. Interviews are surveys whereby a relatively small number of individuals, called the sample, are interviewed for the purpose of estimating the opinions of the population. Now, let's talk about this a minute, because I usually ask a question is, how many people do you think out of the, say 200 million adults in the United States, how many people do you think, what size of a sample do you think surveyors, interviewers would need to talk to, would need to ask the question to ensure a fairly accurate representation of what the public as a whole thinks? So what is the minimum sample size to ensure you know what 200 million Americans are thinking? Well, the answer to that, surprisingly, is small. Generally, if you can interview now you have to do the interviews properly, and you have to use a scientific method when doing the interviews and choosing the people you talk to. But if you do it scientifically, you really only need to ask about 1,200 people in order to get an accurate representation of what 200 million people think. Of course, the more people you ask, the more accurate you will be, as long as you do it scientifically. And the fewer people you ask, the less accurate you'll be. But 1,200 is about the tipping point to where you can really ensure your accuracy. Now, but when doing these public opinion polls, you will always have something called a sampling error. A sampling error. A measure of the accuracy of the public opinion poll. It is mainly a function of sample size and is usually expressed in percentage terms. So basically, you're not going to be 100% exact if you don't ask everybody. So a sampling error is a scientific formulation. Determining the sampling error is a scientific, mathematical process, statistical process by which you admit that you are not 100% accurate because you didn't ask everybody, and the sampling error tells people, well, we know that we're not exactly right, but this is the range in which we know we are right. We know we are accurate, and it is expressed in percentage terms. So let's say we have a sampling error of plus or minus 3%, and let's say we're in the public opinion survey, we did a survey on how people would vote for a presidential election. And let's say, okay, will you vote for candidate A for president or candidate B? Let's say that 47% said they would vote for candidate A and 53% said they would vote for candidate B. And there is a sampling error of plus or minus 3%. So we know it's not that 47 and 53 are not absolutely correct answers because we didn't ask everybody. But since we did our calculations scientifically and we did our statistical analysis, we know for a fact that candidate A will receive anywhere from 44% of the vote to 50% of the vote. That's 47% plus or minus 3%. 47% minus 3% is 44%. 47% plus 3% is 50%. So plus or minus 3%. Now, on the other hand, candidate B, we guessed that 53% of the people support candidate B, plus or minus 3%. That means anywhere from 50% to 56% support candidate B. So this is very important to understand. If you don't see a sampling error in a newspaper story or a television story about a public opinion poll, don't believe the public opinion poll. It wasn't done scientifically. Now, one of the most famous public opinion polls ever done was the Literary Digest poll of 1936. Literary Digest was a national magazine that had been doing predicting presidential elections through public opinion polls since 1920. And they had been accurate um, every election. They had picked the winner. But 1936 rolls around, and we have Franklin Roosevelt running for re-election against a guy named Alfred Landon. And here's how the Literary Digest did their polls. They would get lists of names and addresses from people who auto registration records, people who own cars, and telephone company records. They would get this information, and they would contact these respondents through telephone records and through automobile registration records, and they'd send them information, ask them who they're planning on voting for, and ask them other questions, and then have them mail back the surveys. Well, the Literary Digest in 1936 predicted Alfred Landon would win by a landslide. Of course, we all know, in our American history classes, we've never had a President Landon. We have had a President Roosevelt 4 times. So, well, 5, if you count Teddy Roosevelt, but this is Franklin Roosevelt. But anyway, they failed miserably. What did they do wrong? Well, they did not survey all the potential voters. Their big mistake is how they chose the people to ask the question, because if you think about 1936, we're in the midst of the Great Depression. Most Americans don't have a telephone. Most Americans don't have a car. These Americans are the ones that are most likely to vote for Roosevelt. So the people that were surveyed were generally only the people that were in the middle to upper middle class economic scale, and those are the people that are most likely to vote for Landon. While Literary Digest predicted Landon would win in a landslide, in reality Roosevelt won in a landslide. One person who did get this right and did it scientifically and predicted Roosevelt to win was a guy named George Gallup, whose name is still on one of the most prestigious polling institutions in America, the Gallup poll. Here's a chart that shows the success of Gallup's predictions, and I'm always amazed by this because it's pretty doggone accurate. 1930. Okay, first the blue dots are Gallup's final pre-election prediction since the 1936 election, and then the red dots are the final percentage of votes for the winning candidates. So the blue is the actual is the prediction, and the red is the actual amount of votes. In 1936, the one that Literary Digest predicted that Landon would win. Gallup predicted Roosevelt would get about 56% of the vote. That's the blue dot. In reality, he got about 63%. But still, he predicted the correct winner. And it looks like the only one of all of these that Gallup got wrong was the Truman election, where he predicted Truman would receive, looks like 45% of the vote, but Truman won by a nose with about 51% of the vote. And then from Kennedy up through Nixon, the second Nixon election, he was on the spot. He almost got it perfectly. And then there's some gaps where he misses it and is not as successful in choosing, but for the most part it's a very impressive record of correctly predicting presidential winners. Now, in traditional public opinion polls, there are just basically three phases, or three things you have to do. And even if you wanted to do a public opinion poll for Angelina College or for your community, for Livingston, Texas, you would still go through these 3 phases, whether you do it locally or you do a nationwide poll. Okay, phase one or step one. Determine the content and phrasing of the question. This is vitally important because the words you use can determine and influence the answers you get. Avoid words that bring out a passion or 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 make people think they might skewer one way or the other in the way they vote. It is because you can change somebody's response by just changing the wording of the question. This is very common when doing political polling leading up to wars and whether people support wars or not. I remember I was in graduate school in well, I just no, I was in graduate school in with the beginning of the Iraq War when it began in 2003, and I was watching a lot of news, and I'd switch from channel to channel, and I'd have see one channel arguing, news channel arguing that in our recent public opinion poll, uh, you know 72% of the people support going to war with Iraq. And then another channel I'd switch, they'd say in our public opinion poll, you know, only 47% of the people support going to war with Iraq. And I was like, well, something's wrong here. They're either not doing it scientifically or something else is wrong. So what I'm going to assume is that it was probably content and phrasing. For example, if you were a news organization or a polling organization and you wanted people to support the war, you might ask the question like this, whether they support the war. You might say, do you think the United States should use its moral authority to remove the evil dictator Saddam Hussein and liberate the people of Iraq? Well, um, use our moral authority? Sure, we're moral people. Uh, remove the evil dictator Saddam Hussein and liberate or free the people of Iraq? Okay. Yeah, I support that. That's a good idea. And maybe the other polling network maybe asked a question like this, that where only 47% support it. Should the United States invade the sovereign country of Iraq to support its geopolitical agenda to control the oil fields in the Middle East? You know that that's not necessarily why historically Americans go to war, and it's more likely to create a negative response as far as whether we should go to war or not. Both are bad questions because both use words that influence somebody's opinion. The question should be, should the United States go to war with Iraq? Let people's knowledge of why and all those other issues leave that out, and let people's own knowledge uh, shape their opinion. Selecting the sample, you must have a random sample, which basically means everybody must have the same opportunity to be asked um, the question. So if you're doing a public opinion poll for Livingston, everybody in Livingston should have an equal chance of being asked the question. Nationwide, everybody should have an equal chance. If you don't have a random sample, you don't have a good poll. So if you were going to try to ask people in Livingston, um, you want to know what people in Livingston think about, a certain policy, and you stand in front of First National Bank and ask people questions about it, you know, if that's the only place you ask people questions, that's not a good poll because it's not a random sample, because all you are polling are customers of First National Bank, not necessarily people that don't have bank accounts, First State Bank customers, maybe people that don't have banks, whatever. So you're not getting a random sample. And then finally, the last step is contacting the respondents. There's many ways to do this, but the most common way is called telephone random digit dialing, which is basically you hook up a bank of telephones to a computer, and it randomly spits out telephone numbers from the area in which you are trying to poll. Three things necessary to believe a public opinion poll. I touched on one of them. You must see the sampling error. If you don't see a sampling error, plus or minus 2%, plus or minus 3%, when they show you the poll results, then it was not a legitimate poll. They did not do it scientifically. You must see the exact wording of the question, because you have to judge for yourself whether it is a biased or unbiased question. Refer back to that the one on questions on the war. And then you must see the date or dates the poll was administered. People who aren't very honest will sometimes use old polls in their in their reporting, and so If you use old information or old polls, as we said before, people's opinions can change over time. So make sure it is recent, that that the poll was administered. And then finally, general influences on public opinion. What makes you think the way you do? And we're going to talk more about this in a minute when we talk about political socialization. But number one, uh, the biggest influence on public opinion is personal benefits. Does it help you? Does it make your life better? Does it improve your life? Do you see it as a positive good for you? Then that is the biggest influence on public opinion. We as humans and we as Americans generally support policies that help us, and we don't support policies that help other people and don't help us. It's a selfish gene we have, but it's human nature. We support policies that benefit us. We do not support policies that benefit other people and not us. So that's the number one influence on opinion. Next, political knowledge. How much knowledge do you have? What kind of knowledge is it? Is it a lot of knowledge and good knowledge? Is it a lot of knowledge and bad knowledge, misinformation? That influences public opinion. Lack of knowledge influences public opinion. Cues from leaders. Leaders include political leaders, uh, media leaders, talking heads that we like to watch on TV or listen to on the radio, constantly telling us what we should think and how we should vote and what we should believe. Oftentimes, many of us, we don't even think for ourselves with regard to whether we support a policy or not. We just wait for our favorite television or radio personality to tell us how to think. And this is dangerous, and it is lazy, and we need to do a lot better job as a society, you know, researching policies and how they impact society and ourselves, and not just going by what our favorite television or radio personalities tell us to think, because they don't necessarily have our best interest at heart. They're trying to do the number one thing that television and radio personalities do, and that is get ratings and make money. And then finally, political ideology is an influence on public opinion. Some people, I hear them all the time say, "Oh, that's a liberal policy, I'll never support it," or "That's a conservative policy, I'll never support it." Well, you're doing yourself a big disservice by thinking that way, because you can look back through American history, and there were plenty of conservative policies that worked, that helped, that solved a problem. And there are plenty of liberal policies that worked, that helped, that solved the problem. Nobody has a monopoly, liberals or conservatives, on successful policy. So when we limit ourselves by not even considering conservative or liberal policies, we're basically, you know, limiting ourselves to only half the potential solutions to the problem. Trying to figure out what works regardless of ideology is called pragmatism. Being pragmatic. What's going to solve the problem? And that's the way in which we should really uh, base our opinions, not basic whether it's one ideology or another. Now we're going to talk about political socialization. Just as a definition, political socialization is the complex process by which people acquire their political beliefs and values. Um, that means why they have the political point of view that they have and how they came about that. So that's political socialization. One thing to remember that's very important, that political socialization, or that process of learning your political beliefs and values, is a learning process. It's not ingrained. It's not, you're not born with it. It's not in your DNA for the most part. Uh, but it is a learning process, especially from your parents, which we'll talk about in just a little while. There's a strong correlation between political values of parents and children because of that teaching process, uh, that acquisition process. Now, the whole concept of political socialization is based in something called the primary principle and the structuring principle. The primary principle and the structuring principle. The primary principle says this, basically. It's very simple. What is learned first is learned best. Okay, the earliest things you learn. You come into this world, your brain's a little sponge for knowledge, and those things you learn early on, uh, they stick with you the longest. Language is a good example of that. The first language you learn, even though you don't know anything about language when you're born, once you learn the language, you can speak the language forever. And that's in your primary language you learn at first is the one that's going to be your best language. So the primary principle concept basically means what is learn first is learn best. Now, on top of that is the structuring principle. The structuring principle states that uh, based on the primary principle, because what you learn first, you learn best, all future learning is structured upon the primary principle learning. So you see the world through your primary principle learning. So if you are taught at an early age that, liberalism is good, conservatism is bad, then as you go through life and you're confronted with these ideologies, you will immediately react in such a way, a negative reaction to maybe conservatism because you were taught that's not the proper ideology, and a positive reaction to liberal ideology because that's you were taught that was good. And those are just examples, but I'm just saying that you tend to base all of your assumptions, and you based much of your uh, much of your well, assumptions, I guess that's the best term, your assumptions and your opinions on primary principle learning because you learned that first, and so you look at everything through those glasses and through those concepts. Now, when speaking of political socialization, there are certain agents of socialization. Agents of socialization, and basically these are the institutions, the uh, the things we encounter in life that socialize us, that teach us our values and beliefs. The first and most important agent of socialization is the family. Okay, the family has more impact on your political values and beliefs than any other thing on earth. Uh, why? Well, they're the first people you come in contact with as a child, and we go back to the primary principle: what is first learned is first best. What is learned first is learned best, and so the first things you learn are from your family. So those are the things you learn best. You trust your family, you trust your parents, you trust your grandparents, and the things they tell you when you're a child, you take them to heart. Uh, they exhibit values. They show you how to interact with other people, be it good or bad. Um, the things that you watch everything your parents and your aunts and uncles and grandparents do, and you learn from it. You look at how they treat other people, uh, either good or bad. Uh, and it's not necessarily overt socialization. A lot of it is just subtle socialization, just learning by watching your parents, learning by watching your family. Uh, I argue that nobody is born a racist. Yet when you where do we learn that? Well, I would argue that most people that are racist, their families are, because it's just something that they're taught as a young child. They see how their parents and their family talk about and interact with other people, and they learn it, and they think that's the right and proper way to do it. And so or in another aspect, I mean, think about it this way: when you look at little kids in preschool or at daycare, and you watch them play on the playground together, they all play together and have fun and interact, and they really don't see color. It's just they're just kids. But it's later on when the teaching takes hold that some differences can take hold. So it's a lot of it's subtle. You don't realize you're doing it as a parent, but it just happens because your child is watching everything you do. That's why you need to be very careful about how you act around your child, because they will remember everything. I know I have a young child, and she remembers everything I say. And as I mentioned earlier, uh, party identification, the greatest predictor of party identification of any person is their parents' party identification. Chances are, if you're listening to this, if you identify with a political party, Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, whatever, there's probably about a 90 to 95% chance that your parents identify with the same political party. So family is the first and most important agent of socialization. The Another agent of socialization, and really the second agent of socialization, is school. Because, I mean, once you're at a certain age, either 2 or 3 for preschool or 5 or so for kindergarten. Then you enter into the school system. In most schools, most people that enter the school system are entering a public school system, and and the school systems socialize you. But they don't socialize you specifically. Generally, they shouldn't socialize you to adhere to a specific ideology or a specific political party. What they teach you is the concepts, the larger American concepts. The they teach you the symbols and heroes of the nation. Or at an early age, you learn about the flag. Well, the very first thing you do from the time you're in kindergarten that you learn how to do, and you do it all the way through the 12th grade, is you do the Pledge of Allegiance. That's symbolic. You are symbolizing uh, your uh, your loyalty to the nation by pledging allegiance. Kindergarten and first graders don't even know what Pledge of Allegiance means. They just say it. But it is a part of the socialization process, and all countries do it. All countries, through their school system, socialize their children to support and adhere to their systems, their political systems, their economic systems, and so we teach by symbols. The White House is a symbol. We talk about the heroes, and we extol the values of these heroes like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King. And it doesn't have to be political heroes. It can be economic heroes. Henry Ford, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, whoever you want to think about. We hold these people up as heroes, and you know, uh, great immigration stories like Andrew Carnegie from Scotland, who comes over and becomes one of the richest men in the world. Um, but we're taught at an early age, elementary school, and even in the middle school, about these heroes. We're also taught about the systems that we have. We talk about democracy and representative democracy, and how we choose. We're free to choose in an election the people we want to make our laws. Okay, we learn about our economic systems. We learn about capitalism and free enterprise. And we talk about how they're wonderful things, and they make people rich, and they give everybody an equal chance to succeed. And these are the things we're taught in order for, and this is all primary principle learning for the most part, in order to teach us to hold to embrace the systems and the values of the nation. We're taught about talk about the Industrial Revolution when we're in elementary and middle school, and in the Industrial Revolution, of course, we're taught that it was this probably the greatest economic innovation and entrepreneurism in world history, where we transitioned as a nation from an agricultural to an industrial economy, created great wealth, all these things. Later, when you get into high school, depending on your teachers, a lot of times, you will begin to analyze and critique your early learning. Instead of just extolling the values and saying everything is great about America, you'll start looking at it and looking at the different things and the different systems and the different people, and you will start analyzing what they did and how they did it, and you'll find things to criticize. You'll find out that George Washington and all the founding fathers, even though they and Thomas Jefferson especially, excuse me, wrote the Declaration of Independence, talking about equality of all men, and they're all slave owners. So you start analyzing this and seeing the contradictions and the hypocrisy. You look at the excuse me, look at the Industrial Revolution that we just talked about. How it was a wonderful thing. You learn it in the early years. It's a wonderful thing, but when you start critiquing it, you start understanding that while we did create great wealth, we created it, on the backs of child labor, exploited immigrant labor, horrible, horrible working conditions, and absolutely no regard for the environment and pollution and what we were doing to our world. So you get to start really analyzing your primary principle learning. But here's the thing, because it's primary principle learning, and that primary principle learning was positive, democracy is good, free market capitalism is good. When we start criticizing it, we don't reject it, because our primary principle learning was that it was good. So we're able to criticize it without rejecting it. And then college, especially if you move off to another town, a larger city, a true college town, maybe something like Austin, or maybe College Station, or where any place that's a major university, it can have a very liberalizing effect on you because you're exposed to people that maybe you've never been exposed to before, and you'll come into contact with people that you had predetermined assumptions about because of what you saw on the media about them. And it can be gay people, it can be Muslims, it can be whoever. But what'll happen is you'll be exposed to people, and you might change your mind about your previous assumptions. And it can be very shocking for some people to realize that you're going to be sitting in class with maybe a couple of Muslim students, and at first you're going to be fearful of them because what, that you're taught through the media, subtly and overtly both, that they're all terrorists, and it's a they should be feared. And then what you'll find out is, well, a lot of them are just students like you trying to pass class and having the same kind of issues that other college students have with getting a job and dating and everything else. So and it can be a shock to some people's system when they are exposed to this. But it'll also make you open your mind and liberalize your mind a little bit to thinking that, well, maybe not all people are what I was taught at home or what I was taught on the TV. Speaking of television, the media is another agent of socialization. Americans spend an inordinate amount of time watching TV, so it cannot help but have some impact on how you view the world, what you think about, and your political values and beliefs. There's overt political socialization in the media, such as election coverage. If you watch election returns in a presidential election, you see the red and the blue map, and you see all the numbers on the different states, which there are the number of electoral college votes, and you learn as you're watching that. Even if you've never studied it, you're going to learn something, and you're going to be socialized into the American political system and how it works. Debates are a good example of overt um, political socialization. Uh, they're trying to show you that you make your decision based on comparing and contrasting the ideas of the different candidates. Now we have to be careful about media though, because there is a lot of embedded bias in the media. There's ideological bias in the media, either by specific reporters or specific newspapers, or especially specific television news networks. And so, you have your MSNBC with the liberal bias, you have your Fox News with the conservative bias, and you have to just, I won't sit here and say there's anything wrong with either one, although when you do put too much bias in something, it's no longer news, now it's opinion. But just, it's okay to watch Fox News, it's okay to watch MSNBC. Just recognize when you're watching it, recognize that it is biased coverage and it is biased news. Uh, Also, there is a soundbite bias, which basically all that means is somebody could give an entire speech that lasts 45 minutes, but the news will take about a 10-second clip or a 15-second clip, and they'll show it on the news because that is what they want people to remember about that speech. And it may be taken completely out of context, and it may seem like, well, like when I was talking about the later socialization in schools, high school socialization, when you begin to keep critiquing um, when you begin critiquing the systems and things like that. I discussed how the Industrial Revolution was built on the backs of immigrants and exploited immigrants and child labor and pollution. And if somebody wanted to make me look like an un-American jerk, they could just take that small part out of this whole audio and start showing everybody to it, and they would think I was a huge critic of American capitalism or whatever. That's soundbite. They just took a soundbite out of it and used that to kind of unfairly portray me as you know for or against something. And also, what happens is as we get more and more attuned to our own ideology, we tend to narrow our resources where we get our news. If we find one network or one newspaper that matches up with our ideology, well, that'll be our sole uh, source for news, and it'll be very narrow, and we won't get a true other point of view. We won't get a true counterpoint of view because we don't want to hear things that we disagree with. And if we know If I'm a conservative and I know I watch Fox News all the time and it tells me I'm right all the time, well, why would I go over to any other network and listen to their news when I know I disagree with it? And so I'll just ignore it, even though it's possible that the opposing point of view may be more correct. It may be right. You never know. Also, traditional and alternate sources. Traditional sources are mainly the what we call mainstream media. You know, the major news networks, the major newspapers, and generally those can be generally thought of to be factually correct for the most part because they do check each other. They watch each other to make sure that they're being honest, and they'll call each other out if they're not. Be careful about alternate sources. I know a lot of people like to get these alternate, news websites, especially, Joe's World News, or and and the thing about it is, there is no check. Anybody can, with a computer, can build their own news website. Just because it says it's news doesn't mean it's true. And so you got to be careful about alternate websites. And then cultural socialization. A lot of television shows, just sitcoms or whatever shows, these reality shows, they socialize us culturally. They kind of try to persuade us and tell us how our world should be, or what's wrong with the world, or what's right with the world. And they can also attempt to change people's minds about things, to push agendas, a social agenda potentially. A good example these days, is a show called Modern Family, which has a gay couple who adopts a daughter, and they're part of this bigger family unit, and and they make it seem in the show that this is a normal family, a modern family. The name of the show says it all. This is a modern family, with uh, uh, a gay couple that's married and has a child and all this, and so what it's trying to do is trying to show you through sitcom television that these people do exist, and there are worlds out there that are like this, but you may not know it personally, and they just try to socialize you culturally, and there's all kinds of examples of that. Um, anyway, continuing with agents of socialization, church and religion are also important agents of socialization for individuals. Now, church and religion have different degrees of influence on different people. Some people make religion a very, very important process, or a very, very important part of their political decision making. Oftentimes they'll use religious values or religious dogma as what we call a litmus test for whether they support a candidate or not. And a litmus test would be something like this: if somebody says, I will only vote for a person that agrees with me on this specific issue or is of this specific religion. And if that is the case, if they make that like the most important factor and the deciding factor, then it's a litmus test. A lot of people do that. Other people have a kind of a tendency to disconnect religion from politics. They might argue that, "Yeah, I don't care what your religion is or what your, how you what you do and what your religious affiliation is. If you have a successful background, if you're qualified, if you do a good job, I'll vote for you." And they base it basically just on like policy decisions. So there's quite a bit of a gray area there between individuals, the importance individuals place on religion with regard to uh, political positions. Most churches teach the nature of society, the proper nature of society. Therefore, it does teach socialization. They teach, when you think about the nature of society, most, Christian religions, they'll teach that, a man and a woman in a marital unit is the standard or the optimum, nature of society. And that's why most people who at least this is not a statistical. I don't have any statistical evidence of this, but just in talking to people, most people who oppose gay marriage oppose it on religious grounds because to them it is not the proper nature, quote unquote, of society. So a lot of the teachings of the church will filter into uh, people's political values and beliefs. Also, churches teach. our obligations or the obligations we have to the rest of society, how we're supposed to treat our fellow man, how we're supposed to interact with each other and help each other. And oftentimes, it's in this case, and this is my own opinion, that oftentimes people tend to selectively forget some of these teachings of our obligations to others in our society because they're politically expedient for themselves. Specifically, how in Christianity specifically, but in other religions too, I'm sure, how we're supposed to treat poor people, and oftentimes there's a little bit of a disconnect. Also, age cohort tendency, impacts of events are an agent of socialization. By that we mean whoever's listening to this and watching this presentation, they grew up in a cohort of people. Their peers all grew up at the same time and were exposed to the same events, the same occurrences in their lives, and those events impact how you view the world. Uh, my mother's age cohort tendency that impacted her life was probably the moon landing, maybe. Her, my grandmother's was. Did I say my grandmother? My grandmother's was the Great Depression for sure. That impacted her view of the world. Many people in their 20s right now, probably in their 30s, their worldview is impacted by the events around 9/11. And so the modern generation, I guess, if somebody, since 9/11 happened in 2001, that was 13 years ago, people, 14, 15 years old today, well, older than that, probably 16, 17, 18 years old today, probably have no memory of 9/11. They don't remember that happening. But there will be other events that happen, major events, life altering events that happen that will impact the whole age cohort. Um, Also, social groups can impact your political values and your socialization. Uh, Higher education. If you run in a group of people with higher education, you'll adopt the values oftentimes of the people with higher education. And those tend to be more, uh, also the values of those with more money, because those two are intertwined. Income, your values and beliefs about politics are impacted by how much money you make. Um, Region of the country, which whatever part of the country you're raised in. In the South, you grow up to be with a more conservative ideology, with a conservative socialization. If you grow up in the Northeast, it tends to be more liberal. Um, Race and ethnicity, your your racial group, your family that you grow up in and around impacts your political values. It impacts your the way you view government and the role of government and the nature of government. Um, that's why, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later. But that's why racial minorities are much more likely to support government and a proactive government and a progressive or liberal government, because those people have a long history of being oppressed by other portions of society, and the government is the one that came in and implemented protections for them. So they tend to be more open to the role of government in impacting people's lives. Gender, women and men see political issues differently oftentimes. Women tend to have a more liberal view of many policies than men. And then age. The older you get, sometimes your political socialization, your political ideas and values will change. Um, you know, Generally, as we get older, statistically, we tend to get more conservative. This is a good little graphic regarding gender differences in political opinions, and kind of shows the disconnect or the difference between women and men. Uh, as far as on the left there, the opinions, who wants stricter gun control laws? Only 42% of men, but 60% of women. That's an 18% difference. That is a very statistically relevant difference between gender. And we have to think about, when we see these differences, why they occur. Why do women generally want more stricter gun control laws than men. Favor the death penalty for those convicted of murder. 76% of men do, 62% of women. That's a 14% difference. That's still a significant difference. And the government should spend more money on the military. 55% of men believe that, 40% of women believe that. That's a 15% difference. Um, Farther on down under compassion, government should see to good jobs, standard of living. There's really not much difference there. Federal spending on welfare programs should be increased. There's a pretty significant difference there, where a pretty significant number of women over men think that we should spend more on social services and welfare programs. And government should provide health care for the sick. About a 7% difference, women over men. And government definitely or probably should help reduce differences between the rich and poor. A small difference the between men and women. This chart shows trust in government as a trust in government index, and from 0 to 80 percent that trust government on the left-hand column side, and on the row at the bottom shows the year. And as you can see, during the early 1960s, it got up to 60% average score on the trust index. People trusted the government in the late 50s and early 60s, but beginning in the mid to late 1960s, that trust began to drop. And you can trace that to a couple of historical events, namely the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal involving President Richard Nixon, and during in which the war, really came to a head with regard to protests and things like that in the middle to late 1960s, and that's where you can see the precipitous drop in trust in government. And then, of course, Watergate occurred in the early 1970s, and so you can see an even continuous drop there. Then it kind of levels out and it bounces back up. Starting about 1980, when Ronald Reagan becomes president, he kind of brings back a more trustful environment, or seemingly people tend to have more faith in the government. And then it has varied since then. It drops off 1986, and from about 1994 it bottoms out again, and then begins to rise again. That peak there looks like 2000, 2001, right around 9/11, which you always get a little patriotic fervor and a little more trust in government when you're at war. Of course, that as wars drag on, that trust tends to decrease consistently and oftentimes dramatically as the wars drag on. This chart shows uh, kind of a new way of looking at ideologies. And I would encourage you to kind of read it and see maybe where you fall in, which category you fall into, if you fall into any of those categories. Many people are probably kind of a combination of a couple of the four categories, but we're not going to go into it in any depth in this for our purposes. But I encourage you to kind of read over it a little bit. Now we're going to move on and talk about political participation. Political participation is ways in which we seek to influence government and politics. So, as a definition, political participation, actions of private citizens, that's you and I, not actions of governments, uh, actions of private citizens by which they seek to influence government and politics. There are two types of political participation. There is conventional behavior, which is relatively routine, institutional, and culturally acceptable political behavior. Basically, it's things that are normal, things that when you do them, people don't question them. And generally, by institutional means that our political and social systems are set up to facilitate it and to help you do it. Uh, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. There's also unconventional behavior, relatively uncommon political behavior that challenges or defies established institutions and dominant norms. These are the things you do outside of the standard institutional political system. These are things you do that people do when the traditional avenues of political influence don't work anymore. Uh, and by definition, that means unconventional, not normal, not standard, different. Now, unconventional participation, it was much more common before the advent of democracy, and it's still relatively common in non-democratic countries because one of the points of unconventional participation or sit-ins, protests, boycotts, vandalism, violence, whatever you want, however you want to do it, one of the points of unconventional participation is to make known issues that are generally ignored by the existing government and the existing political system. If the existing political system and the structure does not um, address the problems of a fairly large group of people, then those people will turn to protest. And right now in our society, the electoral process is the mechanism for showing your displeasure. But if the electoral process does not work, much like in the civil rights movement, which is probably the one of the great successful unconventional participation events in our history, if the existing political order does not address the issues, then you must turn to other means, which include protests. But in general, in the United States, violence is not very common and process. In other countries, violence is more common, but in the United States, when people do protest, it's generally nonviolent. There may be threats of violence, but it's generally nonviolent. Now, what happens when you have an individual protest, or maybe a couple of isolated protests, and it spreads and it expands, region wide, statewide, even nationwide, potentially worldwide? If you have an active and sustained effort to achieve social and political change, meaning an active and sustained effort to upset or challenge the political order or challenge the existing political norms, uh, that's called a social movement. It's basically protests that organically grow into a life of their own and last for years or decades. And as I mentioned before, the civil rights movement is probably the best example of a basic protest that turned into a social movement. The modern civil rights movement began with a simple protest of Rosa Parks not getting out of her, not moving to the back of the bus, which the law stated she was supposed to make room for a white rider. And that was a protest. That was unconventional political participation. She was challenging the existing laws, and then it over time turned into the civil rights movement, this a social movement that was active and sustained. Now, when it comes to unconventional participation or protests in the United States specifically, there is a difference between our theoretical support for these types of actions and our actual support. Theoretically, we embrace unconventional participation and protest. If you think about it, when we learn our history, much of our history, the founding of America, is based in unconventional participation or protests against the British government. Things like the Boston Tea Party, the Revolution, uh, the Sons of Liberty and their protests. All of these things are examples of unconventional participation, and when we read about them in history, in general, they're seen as a positive thing because we're challenging a an existing order or a government that is not fair or is oppressing us. But in all actuality, when we see somebody protesting, and if it's not something that we have a vested stake in, if they're not protesting something that we agree with them about, then we generally dislike it and we reject it. And if somebody is marching and blocking traffic or blocking a walkway, and they're protesting for an issue that we or you don't agree with, well, you're going to be mad at them. You're going to say, why don't you go home, you loser? Or, why are you bothering me? Why are you, what's your point? And so generally we don't embrace unconventional protests or unconventional participation unless we actually consciously agree with the purpose of the protest. And effectiveness varies in the protests. In general, though, this is the one thing you need to take out of this. You will not have effective unconventional participation, because the whole point of unconventional participation in protest is to get mainstream America to recognize the injustice, to get the average person to see that you're right. And the one thing that will prevent that from happening more than anything is violence. So if you want your protest, your sit-in, your boycott to work, you can never use violence. You must use uh, peaceful types of protest, because history has shown that that is more likely to work. First, let's talk about conventional participation. There are two types of conventional participation. There is supportive behavior and influencing behavior. Supportive behavior and influencing behavior. Supportive behavior, they're actions that express allegiance to country or government, meaning you support your country. You're not really doing anything actively to try to change policy. You're not trying to lower taxes, or you're not trying to, you know, have government, uh, declare war on somebody. You're simply showing actions that express allegiance to country or government. Some of the most common things that we do are saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Um, you learn that as a small child in the kindergarten. The first thing you learn how to do is say the pledge every morning. Uh, you know, it's symbolic, but it's supportive. It's showing your support for the country. Also, flying the American flag on your car in front of your house, putting an American flag sticker somewhere. That's just supportive behavior. Now, the question becomes, though, is showing displeasure, can that be considered a supportive behavior? If you are displeased with your country, uh, are you supporting it by letting people know that? You know, that's a question we all struggle with. Me personally, I believe that showing displeasure, or making it known that you are displeased in general with your nation, is showing support, because you want to change it for the better. Your goal is to make your country better, and that is supportive. One of the great quotes that I really love is by Mark Twain, and he says this, and let's think about this for a minute. Patriotism is supporting your country all the time and your government when it deserves it. And what he's doing here, he's making drawing a line and a difference between your country and your government. Your country is the geographic area in which you live. Your country are the people and the institutions within that country. Your government is basically the people who you elect, and the people who are making policy and implementing policy. So if you're patriotic, you support your country all of the time, and your government when it deserves it. So you support America all the time, and you support the people making the decisions only when they deserve it. And when they don't deserve it, it is okay. It is supportive to protest against your existing government institutions and government leaders, because in doing so, according to Mark Twain at least, you'd be supporting your country. Now, there's also influencing behavior. Influencing behavior are actions that attempt to modify or maintain policies or leaders. Basically, these are actions you take to try to change government policy, okay, to try to alter the way things are, or possibly keep things the way they are by your actions, your votes, whatever. Generally, our influencing behavior, we partake in influencing behavior to get particular individual benefits. We want personal gain. It's very unlikely that we are going to spend time or money to try to influence policy if we are not going to gain from it in some way. People don't tend to waste their time on things where they get no benefit. So, especially in politics and charity, things like that, uh, that's different. But in politics, usually our interactions with regard to influencing behavior, our interactions with local officials. Rarely do we ever come into contact or speak to or need to talk to national government officials or even state level government officials. Usually any interactions we have, any influencing behavior, any attempts to alter the way things are done immediately is done at the local level. if there's a big pothole in front of my yard, in front of my house, I'm going to call the city of Livingston or wherever you're at, Lufkin, to come fix it. That's influencing behavior. You're maintaining. You're trying to get them to enforce policies of maintaining roads. Uh, if you're upset that the local government's not properly keeping up the local park, you call them and you complain. Well, that's influencing behavior. Uh, Working for a neighbor who's running for city council, or your uncle or brother that's running for school board, that's influencing behavior. Or some examples: organizing groups, PTOs, things like that. Candidate issue support, meaning putting a bumper sticker on your car that says "Vote for Joe Smith" or "Save the whales," whatever. That is influencing behavior. Volunteering for groups or for political campaigns, and probably besides voting, the most common influencing behavior in politics, as far as to trying to get candidates elected or influencing the election of candidates, is contributing money. A lot of people do that because oftentimes they don't have time to actually volunteer to help a candidate, so they will just donate money to a campaign. Now, voting is the most common supportive and influencing behavior. Obviously, it's an influencing behavior because your vote can determine whether a person wins an election or not, which can, down the line, determine the policy. It's also a supportive behavior because if people vote, then it supports the institutions of democracy. It supports the principles on which the United States is founded, which is, you know, representative democracy. So it's supportive and influencing. The only problem is that we are terrible at it. As a nation, we are terrible at voting. Voter turnout. Voter turnout is the percentage of voting age population that actually vote. So the percentage of voting age, meaning 18 or over, that are qualified, if they don't have some exemption or whatever, voting age citizens that actually vote. Regular voters are people who vote in every election. I consider myself a regular voter. I vote in the presidential elections. I vote in the national midterm elections. I try to vote in city elections, school board elections. Regular voters. About 40% of the population are considered regular voters. 40% regular voters. Then you have occasional voters. These people vote in the presidential election usually. They might vote in the midterm elections, midterm national elections, but not always. And they won't generally vote in the local elections unless it's a cause or an individual that they have some personal connection to. And that's about 25% of the voters. 25% of the voters are occasional voters. Then you have the rest of us. 35% of the population rarely or never vote. And most of them never vote. Rarely, they might vote once. But most of them never vote. And then, so that's 35%. That's almost as many as the regular voters. And this frustrates me to no end because it's these people oftentimes that I'm around that complain the most about what government does. And they're the ones that don't participate in the process to try to actually influence the behavior of the politicians. And my daddy once told me that if you don't vote, you can't complain because if you vote, you can complain. If you participate, you have a right to make your voice heard. If you don't, then just keep your mouth shut. That's the attitude. Now, one of the problems with low voter turnout is that the fewer people you have voting, the fewer people determine policies. The fewer people that determine who makes our policies. So the implications of low voter turnout are this. Let's say for instance there's an election and all the regular voters vote and that's it. So you got 40% voter turnout. So let's say 40% of Texans vote for governor, vote for the state legislature. 40%. And let's say statewide it's a very close election. One party wins and the governor wins 51% to 49% as far as the number of people that actually voted. So you have 40% of everybody voting. And of those 40%, about a little over half vote for the winner. Okay? So half of 40% is 20%. So let's just say 21% of all regular voters actually voted for the winner. So 21% of the voting population are determining who is making policy for 100% of the population, if that makes any sense. So basically, if a little over half of 40% voted for the winner, then a little over half of 40% are determining who's making policy for everybody. And that's a problem. That means a very small handful of people are determining your life and the lives, and the issues and the economic and social issues that impact your life. It's a small handful of people for the most part. So the more people vote, the more likely you will get a consensus that what what the public wants is actually implemented into policy. Right now, what 21% of the population wants is actually implemented into policy. So why low voter turnout? Why don't people vote in the United States? Well, the number one reason given is too busy, other things to do. Oh, I was just too busy to vote. It happens once every, national elections at least, once every 2 years. Surely you can find time once every 2 years to take 30 minutes out of your day to go vote. It is a cop-out excuse. It's a cop-out excuse. And anyway, and the thing is, the people that vote the most, and we'll talk about this in a minute, are older people, and of course, policy tends to benefit them the most. So who votes? Who votes? Um, Education. The more education you have, the more likely you are to vote statistically. So somebody with a high school diploma is more likely to vote than somebody that's a high school dropout. Somebody that has an associate's degree is more likely to vote statistically than somebody who just has a high school diploma. Somebody who has a bachelor's degree votes more than an associate's degree, and on up. So it's almost a direct correlation between education and voting. The more education, the more likely you are to vote. Income. The more money you make, the more likely you are to vote. Of course, income often ties in with education because, for the most part, statistics show that the more education you have, the more money you will make over a lifetime. So the more money you make, the more likely you are to vote. Age. These also tie in with income because hopefully the older you get, as you progress in your career, you'll make more money. But the older you get, the more likely you are to vote. Those 65 and older are the most likely to vote. Like 75% of people 65 and older, something like that, vote. Whereas people aged 18 to 25, only about 25% vote. So anyway, gender. I'll catch you on this one. Women are more likely to vote than men. Women are more likely to vote than men. Race and ethnicity. Whites are more likely to vote than all other ethnicities and races. Um, African Americans come in, I believe, second as far as those most likely to vote. And I've got a chart coming up here to kind of show that. And then interest in politics. This is interesting because you can be uneducated, you can have a low income, you could be young, you could be a man, and you might not be in the racial or ethnic category that votes the most. But if you have a strong interest in politics, somebody's interest in politics can override any of those other demographic factors. So that's why you do have some non-traditional people that don't fall in the proper demographics that actually participate in politics and vote on a consistent basis. This graphic or table shows the average percentage of voting age population that voted in national elections between 1945 and 2005. So in that 50-year window. And I'm sure it extrapolates into today. And it's probably going to be very similar statistics today as it is between 45 and '05. So it lists the country and the percentage of people that, on the average percentage of people that vote. Italy, number one, 93% of voting age population in Italy vote in the national election. Well, let's go find the United States. Down, down, down. Australia, Germany, Romania, India, Switzerland, the United States. In this list, we are dead last. 48% on average of the voting age population, actually vote in national elections. Actually vote in national elections. That is just utterly, in my mind, pathetic. This is an interesting graphic. Percentage of registered voters by age, race, ethnicity, and gender. And this, while this only shows the percentage of registered voters, you can extrapolate this to determine who actually votes because it's going to be about the same differences. Because if you're registered to vote, you're more likely to vote. So age, 18 to 24 years old. Only 43% of those 18 to 24 years old are registered to vote. And for the most part, most of them, only half of those vote. So you're looking in the 20th percentile. 25 to 44, you have about 55% that are registered to vote. So, and then of course 45 to 64, you got 69% that are registered. So as you can see, as we said before, as you get older, you're much more likely to be registered to vote, and therefore you're much more likely to vote. Race and ethnicity, whites 68% are registered to vote, blacks 62%, Asian Pacific Islanders 49%, and Hispanics 53%. So of course that category, by those statistics, those that are more likely to be, those that are registered to vote are more likely to vote. And then gender. Women, 68% of women are registered to vote, and 65% of men overall are registered to vote, meaning that women are more likely to vote than men. Now let's talk a little bit about party identification. Party identification. In America, the United States, generally there are two political parties that people commonly identify with, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. There are other political parties, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but for the most part, we are a Democratic Republican and Republican dominated political system in, in a two party system. Party identification, which party you identify with, whether you're Republican or a Democrat, is the most powerful predictor of voting behavior. That makes perfect sense. If you call yourself a Republican, you're much more likely to vote for a Republican candidate. If you call yourself a Democrat, you're much more likely to vote for a Democratic candidate. Um, One of the things that has become a little more common, at least among more independent-minded voters, even though they may identify with one party or another, is ticket splitting. You go down and you research, first of all, before the election, you research the different candidates of both parties to determine, how their policies fit with your own political values, your own political beliefs. And then you just go down and you split your ticket. You vote for some Republicans, you vote for some Democrats, you maybe vote for an independent, maybe a Libertarian or a Green Party candidate, and you just split the ticket. Um, Other ties with political party, ideology and party. In America, the more conservative you are, the more likely you are to be a member of the Republican Party. The more liberal you are, the more likely you are to be a member of the Democratic Party. And liberal and conservative, those things are just kind of ways you view the role of government and how government interacts in your life. And we'll talk more about that later in the semester. But ideology has a strong tie with party identification. Race and ethnicity. Um, Whites tend to much more identify with the Republican Party, and all other races are more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. And that goes back to some historical uh, uh, interactions with the parties. Uh, the Democratic Party under Lyndon Johnson was the party that pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that made it illegal, basically illegal to discriminate. So uh, that type of connection with the party for racial minorities creates loyalty, and they remember that type of thing. Gender, women are more likely to be Democratic, men are more likely to be Republican. Income, the more money you make, the more likely you are to be a Republican. And issues. Some people choose party based on issues. Others choose party based on tradition. Yeah, their parents were Republicans or Democrats, so they are Republicans or Democrats. But oftentimes it's issues. If there's an issue that's important to you, that impacts you personally, you will look at the different candidates, and they may or may not be issues that are important to the political parties, but you will vote based on the issues. There's also one other identifying characteristic when it comes to voting, and that's retrospective voting versus prospective voting. And this is where you go to the ballot box and you're deciding to vote for a candidate or party, and you can do it retrospectively, meaning what you'll do, retro means in the past, retro means old. So what you would do is you would look at what that person has done in the past, what their track record is, or what the party has done in the past, and vote based on that. Retrospective voting. Or you would base your vote on prospective voting. What are the prospects? What are the future? And you would base your vote on what this person is telling you they're going to do in the future, what the party plans to do in the future, what new things do they have planned to solve the problems. So that's prospective voting. And you can vote either prospective or retrospective. And what generally happens is people use a combination of the two. They will weigh what a candidate has done in the past, and also think about what the candidate is talking about he will do in the future, he or she will do in the future, and compare the different candidates and vote based on that. Now let's move on and start talking about political parties. And let's get a definition. A political party is a coalition of interest groups that sponsor candidates for political office under the organization's name. Okay, in America, in the United States, we have, in general, there's other political parties, but in general, it's the Democrats and Republicans. And both of these parties are basically a coalition or grouping of interest groups. Many different interest groups make up the Democrats and Republicans, and their main purpose is to sponsor candidates for political office under their name. They're running as a Republican, they're running as a Democrat, and the goal is to get people elected to implement policies that reflect the what the interest groups want. The whole goal is to get policy made by government that represents the will and the desires of the interest groups. Some basic functions of a political party in America is nominate candidates. We go through a nomination process, which we will talk about here in a little bit, but each party has their own electoral process to nominate candidates for all levels of office, all the way from local government to state level to Congress to the president. And each party has their separate elections. Those are called primary elections, nomination elections. Also, one of the functions of political parties is to structure the voting choice. Structure the voting choice. Republicans versus Democrats, R versus D. Their goal is to make it very simple for us because they don't want it to be too complicated to think about which party is best or which party they should vote for. They want the public to think about things in very, very simple terms. Basically, the Republicans would say Republicans good, Democrats bad. And Democrats would say Democrats good, Republicans bad. And give you very simple reasons why that is true. Republicans, hate America. Democrats hate America, so vote for us, whatever. But in reality, it simplifies and dumbs things down. Uh, in a perfect world, in a perfect democracy, we would all deeply study every policy, all the policies involved with each party, and what they're trying to do within the government system. But most people either don't have time or just don't want to use their time to do that kind of research. So they would rather watch TV and have somebody tell them that this is the way you should vote, and then just nod their head and go vote. Also, political parties should, especially the ones that are out of power, the minority parties in the different groups in Congress or in President, should propose alternative government programs. If the people elected a specific political party and they are running the government and you want to challenge them and you want to claim that you would be a better option than them, then you need to propose an alternative program. It doesn't work. Well, it may work, but it's not. It's really no good to say they're bad, vote for me when you don't have an alternative, when you don't have something that a proposal that is actually better that you can implement once you get into office. And that is one of the problems with current political system. We have a lot of political rhetoric being flown around, but nobody really proposes anything concrete. They just say they're bad, and so you should vote for me. And also coordinating actions of government officials. Once the political parties get into government, they want to coordinate the different levels of government and try to make persuade the government officials to implement policy in the way that the parties want. And so the whole goal is to just elect political members of their political party to implement the will or the desire of the interest groups that make up that political party. Now let's do a quick history of U.S. political parties, kind of get a quick rundown of how they have evolved over time. First, we had the pre-party period, which was pre-1796, and there were no political parties. Therefore, by definition, pre-party period makes perfect sense. And here's the thing: the founders did not like the idea of political parties. Actually, nowhere in the Constitution do they even mention political parties because they were very familiar with the political parties back in England. And their theory on political parties is when you have established political parties, oftentimes those political parties will put their own interests ahead of the interests of the nation. And of course, I think they're very prescient and very smart in recognizing that. But eventually, of course, parties are going to form when these, as we mentioned before, these interest groups or factions come together. But there were while there weren't official political parties in the pre-party period before 1796. There were factions, and the factions are basically divisions or interest groups or divisions amongst political elites. And the factions at this time were the Federalists, who supported a strong central government, were more supportive of um, industrialization and commerce, and believed in a strong central government, as I mentioned, and anti-federalists who believed in state level government was best, and that wanted a weak central government, and believed that a more agrarian economy or a farming economy would work best. So these were the kind of the early divisions between the different elites and the different groups in the United States, and there were the Federalists, the factions, not parties, factions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And of course, it's during this time that George Washington was president. And George Washington was not affiliated with either party. Although he leaned Federalist in many of his policies, he did not identify himself with either of these groups. And then starting in 1796, with the election of John Adams, who was a declared Federalist, and the Federalist political party had formed, it was what we call the first party period, 1796 to 1819. You had the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party, the intellectual leader was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was the intellectual leader of the Federalist Party. And Thomas Jefferson was the intellectual leader or ideological leader of the Democratic Republicans. So going back, of course, Hamilton was also the ideological leader. And and anyway, this was the first party period, and basically the two parties were an evolution or just a changing of the name from the factions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And as we mentioned before, the Federalists wanted strong central government, focus on commercial and industrial growth. The Democratic Republicans believed in a small central government, state power, and an agrarian or farming economy. And of course, it's during this time that the 12th Amendment was passed, which dealt with the election of the president and because one of the problem what happened was in the election, I believe it was of 1800, or was it 1804? 1800. There was a tie in the Electoral College, and the 12th Amendment fixed that problem to where the changing in the Electoral College voting system in electing the president. But anyway, after the first party period, 1819 1820, we convert into what we'll call the era of good feelings. Basically, the Democratic Republicans are the only party during this period. The Federalists have kind of gone away, and the reason for that is this was all a result of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a very controversial war. It was a war that was supported by the Democratic Republicans and vehemently resisted and by the Federalists because the Federalists suffered economically the most with the embargoes that were put into place, the trade embargoes that harmed commercial interests, especially in New England. And so the Federalists were vocally against the War of 1812, and to some people's argument, they were actually almost treasonous in their resistance to the war. But in the end, we defeated Great Britain in the War of 1812, and it created a lot of patriotism, a lot of goodwill, a lot of pride in country. And so once that happened and we did win the war, the Federalists were seen as really as traitorous, and nobody wanted to be identified with the Federalists after this time. So they kind of went away, and it became just the Democratic Republicans as the main party in the United States. And this lasted up until about 1827. Then the second party period began in 1828, and it was all a result of the election of 1824, where you had five Democratic Republicans vying for the presidency, and they included um, Andrew Jackson, um, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay, among others. And what happened was that Andrew Jackson actually won the most total votes in the United States, and Andrew Jackson actually got the most electoral votes in the election. The only problem is he did not get a majority, meaning more than 50% of the electoral votes in the electoral college in the election. And by constitutional rule, you have to get a majority. And if you do not get a majority, then the House of Representatives decides who will be the president. Okay, so you have Andrew Jackson with the most votes and the most electoral college votes. And then you have John Quincy Adams second and Henry Clay third. And so it goes to the House of Representatives, and Andrew Jackson legitimately says, I have the right to win. I mean, I have the most votes of the people and the most electoral votes." But Jackson at this time was considered an outsider. He was not a traditional founder. His family lineage did not come from the founders. He was grew up poor out west, what back then was West Tennessee, and so and he made his fame as a military leader in the War of 1812. So he was not part of the club, if you will, of the original founding legacy of the country. And so what happened was Henry Clay decided to tell all of his supporters in the House of Representatives to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams. And you put Quincy Adams' support along with Clay's support together, and that creates a majority, and that gave John Quincy Adams the win. And immediately after that win, he appoints Henry Clay the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State office is basically the stepping stone to the presidency at this time in our history. Jefferson had been Washington's Secretary of State and become president. Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State. He became president. Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. He became president. And on and on. So it was the stepping stone. So Jackson's supporters called it a corrupt bargain. They said, look, you just traded the office of Secretary of State and a future presidency to Clay for your own victory in this election, and that's not fair. So what happened is Jackson and his supporters branched off from the Democratic Republican Party, created their own political party in the next election of 1828, and ran against John Quincy Adams again and defeated him. And it's at this point in 1828 that we enter the era of Jacksonian democracy. So for testing purposes, the second party period is also the era of Jacksonian democracy. Uh, and the opposing party that rose up out of this period would be the National Republicans, later called the Whigs. And basically they were a bunch of people that just didn't like Jackson. And they formed their own party, National Republicans, and later the Whigs. And then we get to our current party system. The second party system runs till about 1856. And then, starting in 1856 to the current day, we have what's called our current party system, which consists of the Democrats and the Republicans. the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, the Democrats, of course, were formed in 1828 by Jackson and his supporters. Uh, from 1828 on up to 1856, the opposition to the Democrats were it was a mishmash of National Republicans, Whigs. Later, some third parties popped in. But what happened was the issue of slavery coalesced a bunch of anti-Jacksonians and other groups to come together to form one political party under the banner of opposing the expansion of slavery. Opposing the expansion of slavery. And this party turned into the Republicans. Uh, and it consists of anti slavery Whigs and Northern Democrats. Okay, now the Democratic Party, there was a North and South faction of the Democrats. The Southern Democrats, of course, supported slavery. The Southern Whigs, of course, supported slavery. But those in the North who didn't support the expansion of slavery had nowhere to go. They didn't have a political home. So those two parties, along with some other third parties, formed the Republicans as the party. Now, I'm going to make this clear. It's not an abolitionist party at this point. They're not calling for the abolition of slavery. It's basically they're calling to stop any expansion of slavery. So it's formed in 1856, and they actually run a person for president and lose. But in 1860, this is the pivotal election, the critical election that realigns or resets loyalties within the political parties for the long term. First of all, the Republicans, that anti-expansion of slavery party, they choose Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown um, uh, congressman from Illinois, and they run him because of his success in debating the position of the Republicans on the issue of slavery. The Democrats have a problem because they're split. They have the Southern Democrats, which are vehemently, pro-slavery. You have the Northern Democrats that are generally anti-slavery. You have the Constitutional Union Party, which is a faction of Democrats that are kind of just saying, let's forget about it and move on to something else. But the Democrats split their votes in the election of 1860, and by splitting the vote, that allows Lincoln to win without even winning one Southern state. So Lincoln wins in the critical election of 1860, and it's about this point that the two political parties, Democrats and Republicans, really establish themselves. After the Civil War, you tend to have a rough balance between who controls Congress and who controls the presidency between 1860 and 1894. Then you have an era of Republican dominance from 1896 to 1930. The Progressive era is in that period between 1900 and 1920, and it's progressive era where both political parties have a progressive ideology. They all kind of think the same way and how to solve the nation's problems in a progressive or liberal type way. And so that runs till about 1830 with the election of this Republican dominance, and it changes in 1930. I'm sorry, 1930. Um, with the election of with the start of the Great Depression actually, and then Democratic dominance starting in 1932 with the election of Franklin Roosevelt as president and Democratic control of Congress up until 1964, and then from about 1964, 1968 up until today. We have a rough balance. Occasionally we'll have a Republican president, occasionally we'll have a Democratic president, occasionally Republicans will control Congress, occasionally Democrats will control Congress. And that's what we mean by rough balance. Now, while the Democrats and Republicans are the main parties in the United States, we know that there are other political parties that exist today, and there are plenty of other political parties that have existed in the past. Some that were relatively successful, although no third party has ever, since the establishment of the two party system, no third party has ever won a major election, specifically the presidency. But there have been a series of minor parties, or we'll call third parties, either way, minor parties or third parties. One type is a bolter party. These parties leave the existing party. There's a faction or a couple of factions or a couple of interest groups within an existing party that is not happy with the way the party is, where the party is going, what they're supporting, how they're voting. So they break off. They bolt from the existing party. Uh, Two examples of this are the Progressive Party in the during the Progressive era that bolted from the Republican Party. The Progressive Party, or also the Bull Moose Party, was Teddy Roosevelt moving his supporters out of the Republican Party and running separately as a progressive. Then the Dixiecrats in the 1940s, who were unhappy with, they were Democrats, and then they were unhappy with the Northern Democrats, especially in their policies, especially embracing civil rights. And so the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, bolted from the Democratic Party in the early to mid 1900s, and and ran their own candidate for president and actually won a couple of electoral votes. Also, you have farm labor parties. The most notable is the Populist Party. The Populist Party was a coalition of people who supported policies that helped farmers and laborers, um, workers, union members, things like that. Then there's ideological parties, those that exist sheerly not for any specific group, not representing the interests of any specific faction or interest group, but they represent and they adhere closely to representing and supporting a specific ideology, a specific way in which the government and they're usually very rigid in their support of this, that this is the only way and we must do it exactly how the ideology states. And the libertarians, which support very, very, very little government intervention in our society at all, and the socialists, which support a government controlled or government, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Not really controlled, but a, an economy that is greatly regulated by the government. Also, there are single issue parties that pop up. These are parties that arise over one issue that becomes very polarizing or very important to the public. Uh, One of the earliest ones was the anti-Masonic Party, and it rose up in opposition to uh, the Freemasons, which is actually a kind of a society, a secret society. Uh, the Freemasons. A lot of people had a conspiracy theory that this secret group of Freemasons was running the world, running the country, and so this political party rose up, against anybody that was a Mason. Free Soil Party, which was one of the early parties that challenged the expansion of slavery. Free soil for free men, that was their motto. And then the Prohibition Party, which is basically a political party that rallied around the abolition of alcohol, the outlawing of alcohol. Now, minor party lack of success. One of the reasons major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, get in power and stay in power is they have a broad coalition. There's lots of different groups that make up the Democrats and the Republicans, and they stay with the Democrats and Republicans because they're the most likely ones to win. You you want to align yourself with the winner. You can jump onto a third party. Um, you can jump onto a third party and try to support them, but chances are you're not going to win. So you're going to probably go back and end up choosing one of the other political parties that best represents your beliefs. Also, if a third party rises up over a single issue or a group of issues and becomes relatively popular, maybe getting 5 or 10% of the vote, the other parties, the Democrats or the Republicans, are going to see that and they're going to embrace that issue. They're going to say, "What heck? I'm not going to let that third party have 10% of the vote or 5% of the vote over that issue. I'm going to make that issue my own." So maybe either the Republicans or the Democrats will start talking about that issue that gave rise to the third party, and when they capture the issue and they take that issue and make it their own, the third party goes away. Another reason for minor party lack of success is the winner take all plurality system of our election. There's only one representative from any district, and that comes in congressional elections. The All it takes is a plurality of votes to win a congressional election in the general election. You don't have to get a majority, and so generally one of the major parties are always going to get a plurality. But minor party influence does play a role. Minor parties can take enough votes from one party or another in a major election to tip the balance. Good examples are the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, where the Green Party and Ralph Nader, they only won about 3% of the vote, 2 to 3%. But that 2 to 3% that voted for the Green Party, if the Green Party had not run, Many political scientists and historians argue that much of that vote would have gone to Al Gore and tipped the election towards Al Gore instead of George W. Bush, and that changes history. So minor parties can influence election even without actually winning the election. This is a really good flow chart showing the history of American political parties at a glance, is the name of it. And basically, it shows early on the Federalists were the first party to establish themselves, and in response, the Democratic Republicans pop up in 1796, thereby starting the what we'll call the first party system. And then you see that time period between it's shown between 1820 in 1824, which is really, yeah, that's right, my bad. That's the era of good feelings, where there's only Democratic Republicans, and then the National Republicans and Whigs pop up to challenge the Democrats, and then starting in 1856, you just have the blue and the red, the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, farther to the right side, you see some periods, and as you can see, there's a lot of third parties that have popped up during American history. But as you can see, most of them don't last very long. They last for one or two election cycles, maybe three, like the Prohibition Party. But for the most part, they don't last very long because of the reasons we talked about earlier: the capturing of the issues, the difficulty in winning elections. But you see the Prohibition Party, maybe the most prominent one there. Okay, let's begin talking about interest groups now. Interest groups, by definition, a coalition of people or organization that tries to influence public opinion. So it's a group of people, a collection of people or organizations that come together and attempt to influence public opinion and public policy. By influencing public opinion, they are also trying to influence public policy, specifically to benefit their interest. Theories of interest group formulation: how do interest groups form? The most commonly accepted American philosophy on interest group formation is the pluralist theory, or also called group theory. It basically says that there's only so much stuff that the government can do, only so many resources that the government has. And if you want to compete for those resources and you want to compete for those laws, you have to form a group and compete against other groups. Also, another theory is disturbance theory. Basically, interest groups form by changes in the political system. Changes in the maybe one interest group pops up and they demand something from government. Well, anytime an interest group gets something from government, they're making a demand and taking something from somebody else. If somebody wants, if an interest group rises up and wants more tax dollars raised to spend on schools, well, those tax dollars come from somebody else. They come from lots of people. So they are taking tax dollars from those people for their interests. So another group may pop up against taxes. So there may be another group that says, well, we want to lower taxes because we don't like that group over there trying to raise taxes. So when this interest group pops up that says we want to lower taxes, and if they succeed, well, they're taking something from somebody else as well. They're taking tax dollars that go to support some other program, either be it education or military or whatever. If you lower taxes, that means there's less money for that. So you are whatever, almost all the time, whatever demand an interest group makes on government, they're taking something from somebody else. If somebody demands lower speed limits, we want to lower all the speed limits by 10 miles per hour, well, you're taking away somebody's freedom to go as fast as they want, or going faster. There's also transactions theory, that basically all interest groups are exchanges between existing political actors within the political parties. That the public really doesn't have a lot of say. That it's only the leaders of the interest groups that really matter, that make the decisions. And then population ecology theory. It just based on the idea that there's only so many resources that will be allocated to any different issue, and you must have a certain population or a certain strength in your interest group to increase the resources that you might get. So it's about the population and how the world works, the ecology of the interest group environment. Now, there are different kinds of interest groups. There are public interest groups. These interest groups seek the collective good. They're generally there's really rarely any economic benefit or other tangible benefit to belonging to and supporting this group. These are often like good government groups, those that look out for corruption in government. They're watching what our government officials and even businesses as well do, and they expose them when they're doing corrupt things. Uh, some environmental interest groups are considered public interest groups that seek the collective good, because if you're an environmental interest group that's supporting cleaner air policies, cleaner water policies, then that benefits everybody. That benefits the entire public. That's the collective good. Then there are also economic interest groups. These are interest groups that are just created for the specific purpose of increasing the financial interests of its members, promoting the financial interests of its members, to make the members more money, to improve their opportunities in the economy. Things like let's say the American Automobile Dealers Association. American Automobile Dealers Association is an economic interest group that promotes the interests of automobile dealers and tries to get government to implement policies that make it more likely for them to be successful. Then there's governmental interest groups or governmental units. These are just basically cities and states that form interest groups to compete for money from the federal government. Um, there's only so much money that the federal government doles out. It seems like that it's unlimited, but there is a limit to how much money the federal government spends, and so you have to compete. As if you're a local or state government, you have to compete with other state and local governments and other interest groups for those funds. And then there's political action committees. This is a very specific kind of interest group. It's an officially registered fundraising organization that represents the interest groups in the political process. So you might have an interest group like the American Automobile Dealers Association, who has lobbyists and they have people that go to Washington to try to promote their interests. But they also have a political action committee whose sole purpose is to raise money to influence elections. Every single major interest group has a political action committee, which its sole purpose is to raise money and use that money to influence elections and to get people elected that will support that interest group's interests in government. Now let's take a look at the development of American interest groups. Uh, James Madison and the founders. As I mentioned before, the founders, when we talked about parties, they didn't like political parties, and they hoped against hope that political parties would not form. But inevitably they will, because there will always be factions within societies. And these factions will always think that their way is the best way. These factions will always do what they can to promote their own interests and to try to influence government to pass policies that benefit them. That's just human nature. You're going to try to do what's best for yourself and those with similar interests. So they recognized that the founders did that these factions could play a very important and sometimes negative role in the political process. So with the establishment of the Constitution, they implemented certain things into the Constitution with the hopes of limiting the powers of factions or interest groups in becoming much. They were trying to keep the interest groups from becoming too influential in government. So a single interest group couldn't just take over and run the country for their own benefit. And the systems they put into place were three of them, actually. Federalism, which divides power between the national and the state governments. Both are sovereign, and we learned about this earlier in the semester. And by doing this, you spread power out. If the states can check the federal government and the federal government can check the states, then there is it's hopefully less likely that either one or the other can become tyrannically powerful. Of course, today the federal government is much more powerful than the states, but back then it was the power was more equal. Separation of powers, the idea that one person or group of people cannot be in both either the executive and the legislative branch, or the executive and the judicial, or the judicial and the legislative. You have powers that are separated. Also, within the powers, separation of powers, each branch of government has a different role. Congress makes the laws, the executive and the president execute the laws or carry out the laws, and of course the judicial branch defines what the law means and adjudicates the laws. The same person cannot, or the same group of people cannot make the law and carry out the law. The same group of people can't carry out the law and decide who's guilty or innocent or adjudicate the law. You separate those powers, and that prevents one small group of people from controlling all the levers. And then you have checks and balances. Those are those checks that each branch has on the other, um, such as the president has a veto power over Congress. The president, if he feels like Congress has gone too far or passed a law that is against the interests of the American people, the president can veto it. If there's enough support, and that's a check on the Congress, but if there's enough support in Congress that they think the president is not vetoing in the best interest of the country, if they get a two-thirds vote in Congress, they can override the president's veto. So that's a way in which Congress and the president check each other. Also, in the judiciary, the courts have the power. The federal courts have the power, specifically the Supreme Court, to impeach the president. So that's a check on the president. They can remove the president from office. Congress is part of that too. Congress is part of that impeachment process. Actually, Congress does the impeachment process, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over it. Um, uh, the judiciary can declare acts of Congress and the president unconstitutional. That's another check. And of course, the president picks people in the Supreme Court who will sit on the courts, and the Senate must approve it. So that's a check for the president and Congress on the courts. So as you can see, each branch checks the other. Uh, Starting in 1830, national groups begin to emerge. Prior to 1930, I mean, sorry about that. Prior to 1830, most interest groups in the nation were local, or maybe regional, but generally local. And that was mainly because of communication. I mean, you might have a group come together to try to solve a problem in Boston, but nobody else. They didn't have telephones or emails or television or anything like that for people in New York or Charleston, South Carolina, to know what Boston is doing. So these groups stayed relatively local. But when you see the advent of the uh, Morse code and the telegraph, people began to, and the more national expansion of newspapers, you see these interest groups begin to become broader and have more broad-based support. Um, so early on, single issue groups developed nationally. Temperance, the prohibition movement, abolitionism, the anti-slavery movement, the Grange, which was a pro-farmers movement, and then corporations, of course, have their own interest groups and their own interests. And it's during this time when interest groups become national, that lobbyists, or these people that uh, are hired by the different interest groups to argue their point of view to and influence Congress, enter the system. So lobbyists begin to when national parties emerge, lobbyists begin to infiltrate the system and become very important players within the interest group system. Then you have the Progressive Era and the New Deal from 1890 to 1950s. We've already talked a little bit about the Progressive Era. Basically, the Progressive Era was an era of rapid industrialization, immigration, and monopolistic business practices. And basically the Progressive Era and the New Deal does, it's a reaction to that. Okay, they're saying, look at all of these problems that are being caused by industrialization, immigration, monopolistic business practices. What can we do about it? And those were the Progressive New Deal policies. And basically, they consist of organized labor. How do we challenge monopolistic business practices? How do we challenge poor working conditions, low wages, child labor? Well, organized labor. Collectively bargain for higher wages and better working conditions. Business groups and trade associations, of course, then form to counter the the power of the organized labor groups and these other groups. So that's disturbance theory. One group pops up, another one will pop up. So business groups and trade associations become more powerful. And because of all the problems involved with um, monopolistic business practices and illegal and unethical business practices, the Federal Trade Commission is formed. And it's to investigate one of the charges of the Federal Trade Commission is to investigate the lobbying tactics of interest groups, how the lobbyists are influencing government policy. Because it was not uncommon for lobbyists just to go and bribe members of Congress, just to walk around Capitol Hill where Congress meets and hand out bags of money saying basically vote for the bill that we support and give them $1,000 or whatever. So these things had to be investigated and hopefully limited, and that was the purpose of the Federal Trade Commission, or one of the purposes of the Federal Trade Commission. Then in the 1960s and the 1970s, you see the rise of what we'll call the interest group state. Um, Interest groups surge, especially what we'll call identity interest groups, groups that form to promote the interests of a certain group of people, demographic group of people. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Color People, formed to challenge and fight the segregationist laws, especially in the South. Uh, you know, uh, the NAACP was the driving force behind of course, the earlier um, segregated schools, but of course, segregation, economic segregation, economic discrimination still occurred in different parts of society, and so the NAACP becomes even more powerful and more influential. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, fighting for and arguing for the protections of our civil liberties, First Amendment rights. Anti-war groups, MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, basically the Latino version of the NAACP. Then you see women's rights groups like NOW, National Organization of Women, AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. And then you have gay rights groups. So you have the surge of these groups coming to the fore, uh, arguing for rights for their members, rights for these people. And of course, anytime you have this, as I mentioned before in disturbance theory, anytime you have the rise of interest groups, you will have a backlash. And you get a conservative backlash from basically white Christians who fundamentalist types, Christians who challenge this upsetting of the existing order and challenge the traditional values that they see as important. And the conservative response during the 70s and into the 80s was something called the Moral Majority, which was led by a guy named Jerry Falwell, and another group called the Christian Coalition, which, and both of these groups attempted to rally people to vote based on their religious beliefs. Then you have business groups, corporations, and associations, the Business Roundtable. Most large corporations have their own interest groups. And then organized labor. Organized labor, as we saw earlier, really became important in the progressive era, but and it really peaked in the 1940s and 1950s. But recently, it has seen a precipitous decline. There was an overt effort by the government, especially with the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan, to destroy unions or at least to cripple them to such a way where they uh, had very, very little influence. Uh, the AFL-CIO and the SEIU, American Federation of Labor, and the Convention of Industrial Organizations, or I think that's what that says, and the Service Employee Union is the SEIU. These are still unions that exist, but not very much influence these days. Okay, now what do interest groups do? Mainly they lobby. Lobbying is the key component in any interest group. Uh, they are organization activities that seek to influence political leaders. If your interest group does anything to try to persuade members of Congress or try to persuade members of government to act on your behalf, you are lobbying them. You are acting as a lobbyist. Uh, Congress is generally targeted first. If you're a lobbyist, you want to hit Congress first because they're the ones that write the laws. If you can catch Congress and influence Congress and lobby Congress before or as the laws are being written, well, then that's the best place to be. Then the laws can be written to benefit you. Uh, Now, one of the problems with this is that many of these large corporations um, that attempt to lobby members of Congress and especially committees in Congress. Well, members of those committees, you know, if they work on behalf of those corporations, if members of Congress do things and pass laws to benefit these lobbyists and these corporations, well, after they leave Congress, these congressmen can go work for um, these corporations, and these corporations are going to hire them to thank them really for their work in helping them get laws passed. So you end up seeing a revolving door from congressional work to lobbying. And a lot of these ex-members of Congress will turn around and lobby the very people and the very committees that they used to work in because they have access. They know these people's home phone numbers. They play golf with them. And so these corporations find a lot of value in that. Wouldn't you, if you were a large corporation or a large interest group, want to hire lobbyists that already knew the members of the committees that actually wrote the laws that influenced you? That would be perfect. So you see this revolving door from congressional work to lobbying for um, interest groups. Now, once the law is passed, though, that's not the end. Once the law is passed, you can lobby the executive branch because the executive branch is the one that actually carries out the law. Uh, if Congress passes a tax law that says, okay, we're going to change the tax rate to this, well, Congress doesn't enforce that law. The IRS, which is part of the executive branch and works for the president, enforces that law. So you want to lobby the executive branch to make sure that the policy is being enforced in a way that best benefits your interest group. You can also influence the courts. You can also lobby the courts, and that is generally done through something called amicus curiae briefs. Amicus curiae is a Latin term for friend of the court. Friend of the court briefs, amicus curiae. Basically, it's just a legal document or a brief that you send if there's a court case before the Supreme Court or the federal courts that impacts your interest group. You would write them a legal brief saying this is why you should vote or you should rule in this way in favor of our interest group because these are the legal reasons. And so that's all an amicus curiae brief is. It's a friend of the court brief that attempts to influence the decisions of the judiciary. Also, interest groups can do grassroots work, basically rallying their individual members to put pressure on politicians through phone calls, through emails, faxes, whatever. You can rally up the rank and file to contact members of Congress or contact their politicians. And then the last resort, usually for interest groups, is protest and radical activism. And we talked about this earlier. There's a long history in the United States of this, but it's a risky proposition. But if you feel like that you have a legitimate problem or legitimate purpose, and your group is not being adequately represented and adequately attended to in the existing governmental system, well, you might want to protest. You might want to march. You might want to boycott. And this is just a little chart that shows interest group tactics and what percentage of interest groups actually use these tactics. Of course, testifying at hearings. This is the most common one. That's number one, and that's the one you should probably know because every law comes out of a committee, and every committee, when they're debating whether to pass a law or move a law onto the floor of the House or the Senate for a vote, they want to hear from those that will be impacted by the law, and those are called hearings, committee hearings. And this is where the lobbyists can come in and speak at these hearings to promote the interests of their interest group. All right, let's talk about election activities of interest groups. They do quite a few different things. They recruit candidates and they endorse candidates. as far as recruiting candidates and finding candidates that support their point of view or their policies, they may actually find existing candidates and train them in ways to speak about their policies or their issues. Or, of course, like most interest groups do, they offer financial assistance to candidates because winning elections historically has been about, you know, all about the money and who has the most money. Also, some of the activities they do would be like getting out the vote programs, uh, actually finding people in the that support your policies, your interest group's goals, and persuading them and encouraging them to get out and vote. Uh, Staying in constant contact with them, reminding them that the elections are coming up, and then sometimes helping them get to the polls. They can rate candidates or office holders. There are a lot of websites out there run by interest groups who rate the different members of Congress or the different candidates based on how often they vote for policies that benefit that interest group. And so they would have 100%. You know, if every vote went that dealt with, say, an environmental issue, then an environmental interest group might give a congressperson 100% rating. If they never voted in favor of environmental regulations, they would give them a 0 rating. So there's many websites out there that do that. Also, providing campaign contributions. Talked about that just a while ago. Most all major interest groups have something called political action committees, PACs, and these are just fundraising arms of the interest group. And as we know, money is the most important component of success uh, in elections for the most part. There are exceptions where people with less money win elections, but it's rare. And then interest groups can even run their own ads. It's called direct advocacy. They will just create their own ads, pay for their own ads in support of a candidate or a policy or an issue. Uh, because of recent Supreme Court decisions, including Citizens United, uh, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, uh, these interest groups and these political action committees can spend as much money as they want. So, a huge corporation like Walmart or Exxon or Microsoft can basically spend millions, if not billions, of dollars if they want to get a person elected. And in my mind, that unfairly skewers the democratic process in favor of wealthy people, wealthy corporations, and wealthy groups, interest groups. So in the end, what makes interest groups successful? There are interest groups that do a very good job at persuading policymakers and the public to support their cause. Others not so successful. Well, probably the most important. Well, there's the two most important are leadership and funding. Leadership includes you have to have somebody, people at the top, who can recruit members, who can organize the resources that the interest group have, including money and people. Uh, a good leader would be able to raise money for the interest group. And maybe most important for leadership in an interest group is having access to policymakers. That's why that revolving door that I talked about in class is important. If you already know the people on the congressional committees making the policy, it makes it much more likely that you will have access to them. They will listen to you. They trust you. They know you. So leadership must have access to the policymakers. And you can have all the recruiting, organizing, and fundraising you want, but if you can't talk to the people making the policy, you probably won't have a lot of success. Funding and patrons, money, people to give you money. Money is required for advertising, litigating. That means suing, going through the court systems in order to defend your cause or promote your cause. And of course, you have to pay money to lobbyists to promote your interest group in government. So money is vitally important, and also, well, I mentioned running ads, and then of course members. Members are broken down between leaders and workers, rank and file. Leaders, there's relatively few, just like in any organization. You have a few leaders that organize and recruit, fundraise. Then you have the workers, members of the interest group. They attend meetings, pay dues, and volunteer their time and actually do things for the interest group. So these are the workers of the interest group. And but the most common member of an interest group would be just what we call rank and file. They may pay dues, and they may uh, donate money, but they don't really do anything. They don't attend meetings. They don't actually go out and door to door for fundraising or get out the vote or anything like that. Generally, they are just members in name only, and that's the majority of most members of an interest group. Members of interest groups, those that involve themselves in interest groups, tend to be wealthier than the average person, and they tend to be more educated than the average person. And what happens is, oftentimes, these wealthier, more educated people, not only are they a member of one interest group, they're a member of multiple interest groups. So their influence and their money overlaps different interest groups. So they tend to be much more involved in the political process. Of course, we talked about in class, the wealthier and the more educated also vote more. So it makes sense that they're more likely to be involved in an interest group. Now, all interest groups have one major problem, and that is called the free rider problem. And the free rider problem basically is this problem of people who benefit from the interest group's work, who reap benefit from higher wages or cleaner water or lower taxes that the interest groups have worked for, but yet they're not part of the interest group. They don't pay dues. They don't do anything to help. They're a free rider. They get all the benefits of the interest group, yet they don't do anything. And a lot of times, if people know that they're going to benefit, they will choose not to. If they're going to know they're going to benefit without involving themselves, they're going to choose not to involve themselves. So this has always been a problem with interest groups. This problem of free riders. Political scientists have kind of organized the relationship between interest groups, Congress, and the bureaucracy, which is really kind of the executive branch, the bureaucracy, the people that the carry out the laws. And there's a very, very consistent relationship between the three, the interest groups, Congress, and in the bottom corner of that it looks like the CONG part of Congress has been cut off, but that should say Congress, and the bureaucracy. Uh, Interest groups provide Congress with electoral support. They run ads for them. They donate money to their campaigns. And in return, you see the arrow going up from Congress up to interest groups. They get friendly legislation, friendly oversight, because you don't want to anger the interest groups that are giving you money. Now, the interest groups also lobby the bureaucracy or the executive branch, so the policies will be put in place in such a way that it benefits them. Also, the interest groups will try to encourage the bureaucracy to ask for more money for the causes that the interest group is interested in, and so the bureaucracy is benefiting from the interest groups, and in return, the bureaucracy gives the interest groups low regulation on whatever industry it is, or favorable regulation on whatever industry is that the interest group involves itself in. Now, Congress also funds the bureaucracy. Remember, the Congress is the power of the purse. They fund the bureaucracy. So that arrow going funding and political support to the bureaucracies exist only because Congress pays for them, and in return, the bureaucracy implements the policy in such a way that Congress would like, which usually benefits the interest groups. So all these working parts, it's kind of that you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back kind of arrangement between the three parts of the iron triangle. For testing purposes, just kind of know that the iron triangle consists of the interest groups, Congress, and the bureaucracy, and they all do things to benefit each other. Now, these lobbyists that work for the interest groups, their job is to persuade legislators to pass laws that benefit them. the potential is always there for corruption and illegality, such as bribery. I mean, historically, back in the early days of lobbying, back in the beginning of the huge railroad companies, railroad lobbyists would just walk around Congress handing out bags of money to the legislators, just blatant bribes. Over time, the government decided it was probably a good idea to regulate the lobbyists, to have some oversight over these people that are influencing Congress and influencing the laws. So in 1946, Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act required registration and quarterly financial reports of lobbyists. Okay, who are the lobbyists? If you're going to lobby in Congress, you have to register and you have to report any money that's spent in the process of lobbying. And that was the main law. Oftentimes it was weekly regulated and weekly enforced. 1995, the Lobbying Disclosure Act required registration of all lobbyists with the House or Senate clerk, whichever branch of whichever house of the Congress you were lobbying. Two, you had to report clients and issues and agency lobbied. So if you were a lobbyist and you were lobbying anybody, either Congress or the executive branch, you had to report who you were lobbying, what issues you were talking about, and which agencies were involved in this. And then, of course, you had to estimate your pay. You had to report how much money you were receiving from the interest group that you were lobbying on behalf of. And then in 2007, a new law was passed, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, and basically placed limits on the revolving door time limits, where I think it's 2 years. You cannot go directly from Congress to lobbying. You have to wait 2 years by law. It's to prevent that revolving door, but it's still, I don't believe it's enough. Should be, I personally believe that a member of Congress should be banned from lobbying, at least lobbying for the industry in which they made laws and they were a member of the committee. Ban on gifts and more disclosure. Executive branch lobbyists, they have pretty much the same limitations and same standards for regulation as congressional lobbyists. Finally, let's talk about campaigns and elections. Campaigns and elections. First, let's talk about the purpose of elections. Why do we even have elections? Our first instinct is to say, so we can elect people. And that makes perfect sense. That's all democracies. But there are more underlying, deeper reasons why nations and governments want elections. First and foremost, elections provide legitimacy to government. Legitimacy basically means that the people respect the government's right to be there. They respect the laws that the government makes, and they are not committed. That's not the word I'm looking for. They are obligated to follow those laws. And the only way that this legitimacy of government can be achieved is through the electoral process. The only way people are going to follow laws of a government is if they choose the members of the government making the laws on their behalf. That's simple social contract that we talked about early in the semester. So democratic elections or authoritarian elections. Now we know that we have democratic elections for the most part. What that means is just about, with some exceptions, just about anybody can run for office that wants to run for office. And we're free to vote as citizens for whoever we want to vote for. That's a democratic election. The media must, in a democratic election, must run ads and allow any candidate to place their ads in that medium. Now, so that's your traditional democratic election. Now, there's also something called authoritarian elections. All over the country, there are dictators who have elections in their country every year, and of course, they always win with like 99% of the vote. Those are not necessarily democratic elections. They're what we call authoritarian elections, where there usually is only one candidate. Nobody can run to challenge the existing dictator or the existing members of the government. There's threatening oversight. There's intimidation to force people to vote in the correct way, And the media, which is usually state controlled by the government, will usually never run any advertisings that support the opponent, if there is an opponent, of the authoritarian leader. So that's the difference. Saddam Hussein used to have an election every 5 years in Iraq, and he would win that election with 99% of the vote. That's not a democratic election. That's an authoritarian election because nobody is free to vote how they want. Nobody is free to run against Saddam Hussein, and the media, which is controlled by Saddam, basically was required to only air positive ads for Saddam Hussein. Also, another purpose is that it may provide a mandate. An election may provide a mandate. If you get a majority of the vote in an election, then you basically have a mandate. And by definition, a mandate is a command indicated by an electorate's vote for the elected official or party to carry out their platform. And what it means is this: if I'm running for president and I'm campaigning for an entire year before the election, and everywhere I go, I say, okay, when I get elected, I am going to implement policy A, policy B, and policy C. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this when I'm elected. I'm going to do this when I'm elected, and I'm going to do this when I'm elected. A, B, and C. And I say this to everybody, and everybody who goes to the polling places to vote knows that that's what I've been saying. Therefore, if I get elected, I have the right to, I have a mandate to carry out policies A, B, and C, because everybody knew that that's what it said I was going to do, and they voted for me. So that's a mandate, and the bigger the election margin by which you win, the greater your mandate is. If you just squeak by, winning 51% to 49%, well, you got 49% of the people that didn't want policy A, B, and C. But if you win with 65% of the vote, then you've got almost, 2/3 of the public that says, yes, I want policy A, B, and C. So the greater the electoral winning percentage, the greater the mandate. Now, there are different types of elections. Nomination election, process by which parties choose their candidates. Each political party in all national elections, they each have their own process of picking the candidate that they will run against the other party's candidate. This is the nomination process. And there's two ways to do this. First is a caucus, where members of the party in different locations throughout the state and the country meet. Now, you have to be a member of the political party, and you have to take time out of your day to go to these meetings to select the candidates. Usually it's just party activists that go to the caucuses, not just your average Joe Schmo. The other type is a primary election, where members of your political party will go vote in a primary election, which come usually just 6 months, 8 months before the general election. The primary election, you can vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, and in that election you choose the Democrat or the Republican, whichever one you vote in. You choose which candidate among those you want to run in the general election against the opposing party. There are two types of primary elections: open and closed. Closed primary elections, you can only vote in that party's primary election if you are a registered member of that party. In an open primary system, you may vote. You don't have to be registered with either party. You only have to be a registered voter, and you can vote in either one of the party primaries. But you can only vote in one. If you vote in the Republican primary, you can't, the same day or the next day go vote in the Democratic primary. Texas is an open primary state. If you are a registered voter, you can vote in either primary, but you can only vote in one of those in each election cycle. Then, once all the parties have determined and have nominated their candidates, then they will run in the general election. That's the national election where voters decide who will actually take the office. Remember, the primary elections and the caucuses are only determining which member of that party would actually run for the office under the party label. Now, once that has been determined, you have the general election where the Democrat that was chosen in the primaries and the Republican that was chosen in the primaries, they run against each other to determine who will actually become the member of Congress, the governor, the president. Other types of elections, the initiatives. Now, Texas does not have any of these. These are very progressive types of elections that many other states have, but not Texas. An initiative is an election where the citizens propose legislation or citizens propose the law, usually by a petition, and then it's submitted to the state electorate to for a vote. So that an initiative completely bypasses the state legislature when passing laws, because the citizens propose it and the citizens vote on it. A referendum, uh, the legislature actually submits the law or the legislation to the voters to decide on whether to pass it or not. So the state legislature would say, okay, we want to pass this law, but we don't want to do it ourselves. It's so important that we want the people to decide. So they submit it to the voters. And then a recall uh, is to remove an incumbent from office before their term is up. Maybe they've committed a crime, or maybe they've done a very poor job, and we don't want another 2 or 3 years of that person in office. So you can have a recall election to force a new election to determine whether that sitting official, the governor or whatever, will stay in office or will be replaced. Here's a map that shows methods of selecting Democratic Party presidential delegates. These are purple are closed primaries that we talked about, where you must be a registered member of that political party to vote in their primaries. Open primaries are kind of that teal color, that greenish teal, where you just need to be a registered voter and you can vote in either primary. Texas, of course, is an open primary state, and then the orange ones or the gold ones are those with that use the caucus system. Of course, the most famous caucus is the Iowa caucus, which is the first one of the first caucuses and first elections, primary elections, in each presidential election cycle. Okay, now let's talk about presidential elections a little bit. Presidential primaries and caucuses. Okay, every 4 years, we did it in 2012. We'll do it again in 2016, again in 2020. We have presidential elections, and we go through the very process that we just talked about in order to decide who will run for the office, and then we will then in the end choose the presidential candidate that will win the election and assume the office. So the primary process and the primary caucus process, that is that process of both parties choosing which candidate they want to finally run for the office. The key and the goal in this process, the primary process, is to accumulate a majority of that party's delegates. Each state, usually based on their population and the number of party members that they have in each state, each have a certain number of delegates. And these delegates commit themselves based on primary elections or caucuses. These delegates commit themselves to vote for whichever Republican or whichever Democrat they are they are part of. If they're part of their primary or nomination process, they're committed to voting for those at the national convention. Now, the goal is to get a majority. Once you get a majority of your party's delegates, then you win that party's nomination. The key here to winning a party's nomination is early momentum. You have to win early. And the earliest primaries and caucuses are the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. And so any candidate for president that wants to win their party's nomination is going to spend a lot of money and a lot of time in New Hampshire and Iowa. Why is it so important to get that early momentum? Well, first of all, the news is all over these, or they're all over these primaries. They're covering them, so much in a 24-hour news cycle. They're covering almost all the time. And so you may have 7 or 8 candidates vying for the Democratic nomination or the Republican nomination. And so if you have 7 or 8 candidates, um, when the first few elections are over, the first few nomination elections, the primaries and caucuses are over, the media is going to be focusing on who? the winners. Who won, who came in second. They're going to get all the media coverage. Who's not going to get any media coverage? Who's not going to get any FaceTime on television? Those that came in fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. So news coverage. That's FaceTime on TV that is so valuable to winning elections, to get your name out there, name recognition, to show the people that you can win. And that ties in directly with fundraising because there's a lot of people out there, a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans who are sitting there with money in their pockets, and every presidential election they donate money to a candidate. Well, if they're sitting there watching the first couple of caucuses and primaries, uh, they're going to want to give their money to somebody that has a chance to win. And so they're probably going to wait till the first couple of primaries or caucuses and decide, well, who's a viable candidate? If you come in seventh or eighth, nobody's going to give you their money because that would be wasting money in their mind because you don't have a chance to win. But if you come in first, second, or third, well, you've got a shot. So you're more likely to be able to raise money. That's why winning early is so important. Also, because winning early is so important, these candidates spend tons of money in Iowa and New Hampshire. And now other states want some of that money, so many states are what we're calling front-loading their primaries, moving it sooner, earlier in the election cycle in order to get some of that advertising money, hotel, restaurant money that goes into Iowa and New Hampshire. Now, once the primaries and caucuses are complete, and each party determines who their candidate will be, they have the National Party Convention. They have it every 4 years, and the out-of-power party goes first, meaning, and the presidential party. So let's President Obama is a Democrat. So in 2016, which is when the next National Party conventions will be held, the Republicans will go first because they're out of power in the presidency. Historically, oftentimes nobody knew who the candidate would be for each party until the National Party convention, and they would actually choose the nominee at the convention. That could cause a lot of problems and could be very controversial. Now, um, today, everybody knows who the candidate will be before they even get to the primary. You don't even try to um, determine it because what happened was especially a good example is in 1968 at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Of course, in 1968, you're in the middle of the Vietnam War. You're in the middle of the countercultural movement, the hippies, all that, but mainly the Vietnam War. That was a huge issue at the time in that presidential election. And the Democratic Party was split between pro-war Democrats and anti-war Democrats. And that split was manifested itself on the floor of the convention, where there were actual fistfights and conflict. And outside the convention center, in the streets, there were anti-war protests, and the police came in and uh, were billy clubbing people, and it was all on national television. And they had not yet determined who the nominee would be. Would it be the pro-war nominee or the anti-war nominee to run as a Democratic candidate for president? Well, what happened was everybody at home, Joe Sixpack sitting at home, was looking at the Democrats going, "Oh my goodness, why would I want these people who are just brawling with each other to be running my country in the general election?" So in the general election, the Democrats got hammered. And it was a good lesson for both the Democrats and the Republicans. You better have your candidate chosen before the highly publicized, televised national conventions. So today it's just a unifying event. It's a pep rally, really, where all the after they've already chosen the person that would run, the former opponents in the primaries and in the nomination process will come back and support them and, promise to be a good soldier and support the candidates. Also, what will happen usually in the National Party Convention is that the presidential candidate will choose his or her vice presidential nominee. Now, once each party has completed the nomination process and decided who they want to be their candidate for president, then you have the actual presidential campaign. Uh, the candidate, there's certain aspects, there's certain traits that each of them have. Anybody that reaches this point in their uh, political career must be highly motivated. And running for president is one of the most exhausting things that any person can do, because you're going state to state, town to town, every single day, giving speeches, shaking hands, raising money, having, kissing babies, all those things that presidential candidates do. And so and it is a nonstop uh, campaign for probably at least, um, a year, at least a year, usually longer. Uh, but one thing about it, you're not doing it by yourself. All candidates have an extensive staff of volunteers and professionals. The volunteers do things like going door to door, uh, you know, calling on phone banks to try to get people to vote. Then you have professionals, which these are generally people who are advisors, media advisors, campaign managers, pollsters, professionals that do specific jobs within the campaign to help the candidate get elected, to help the candidate hone their message, to help them, uh, make critical decisions and strategize in order to win the election. Uh, Now, the biggest part of a presidential campaign is the media. If you have paid any attention to any previous presidential elections, and I hope you pay attention to the future ones, um, media is necessary and expensive. You got to have it to reach the people. You got to have it to persuade people to vote for you, the candidate. There's two types of media. There's paid media and free media. Of course, paid media, obviously, by definition, is you pay for it. It costs money. But the reason it costs money is that you control the message. These are generally advertisements, commercials, uh, and you control the message. Therefore, you pay for the right to put it on television or on the radio or in a newspaper. There are different types of ads or messages that you can project. Positive ads, where you talk about how great you are as a candidate, and it's very positive. All the great things you're going to do, your history, your family, all those things. There's also negative ads, which are very popular, and because they tend to work, where you don't really talk too much about how the great things you will do as a candidate. You just bash the other guy. You talk about how terrible the opponent is and how they're going to destroy the country if they're elected. And usually it's all hyperbole and it's all overblown, but that's part of the campaign process, unfortunately. Then you have contrast ads, which basically you contrast, as a candidate, you would contrast your policy positions or your experience with the other guy's experience or the other woman's experience. And so, this is how I would do it. This is how they would do it. My way's better because of A, B, and C. That's a contrast ad. And then an inoculation ad is just an ad to kind of an inoculation is when you inoculate yourself from a disease, you get an immunization where you prevent worse things from happening by kind of taking your medicine early. And what happens is a lot of times when you run for president, the opponent will always be trying to dig up negative stuff about you, in your past or whatever. And so if you find out that they've dug up negative stuff, you want to get out there and talk about it first before they can run an ad or they can talk about it. So if maybe you had a hidden criminal record or something that nobody knew about, but they found out about it, your opponent did, and they were going to report it, well, you would come out first and say, I've been thinking about it, and I wanted to come clean on something that happened in my earlier years, and so I did this, and I've learned my lesson. I'll never do it again, and you can support me now. And so, we're a nation of second chances, so those things generally work. Now, free media, that's where you go on, you can go on television shows or, like you want to go on Jimmy Kimmel or the Tonight Show or those Sunday morning talk shows. If you go on those, it's free. It doesn't cost you anything to go on those shows. So you're getting free FaceTime with the American public. Millions and millions of people get to see you, get to hear you talk, get to hear you discuss your policies and get to see you as kind of a human being. So that's the pros of it. That's great because you're getting exposure. But there's a negative side of that, and that is you don't. It's not scripted. You don't control everything. You don't really know what questions might be asked. And if you slip up, it's live usually, so you can't go back and fix it like you could if you were taping a commercial. So you have to be very, very careful in these free media environments because you can really make you can make bad mistakes. Now, it's another aspect of presidential campaigns is campaign finance. Elections are very expensive, advertising especially. 2008, I haven't quite updated it yet, but 2008, over $1 billion was spent. That's $1,000 million was spent amongst the two major candidates uh, in the election. Uh, in the past, there are individual contribution limits as far as what you can give directly to the candidates, but the Supreme Court has ruled in Citizen United case that interest groups and anybody else can spend as much money as they want, even if it's in the billions of dollars, just one person or one company, to run their own ads in favor of a candidate. So this greatly skewers the political landscape in favor of the wealthiest people. They're able to reach many, many more voters than just say the average person. Now, in the general presidential election, people within each state they go and vote. Okay, and when they go and vote, they are basically voting for their state's members of the Electoral College to go choose who the president will be. Now, the Electoral College is just a system of election. It's just a group of people who represent each state, and they actually choose the president. The founders' purpose of this was to create a buffer between the selection of the president and the masses. The founders did not trust the masses. The founders did not trust the average farmer, the average person, to be smart enough to choose a good president. So they wanted to make sure that if the people made a bad choice, that there was a mechanism to change that choice. And that mechanism is the Electoral College. Now, for the most part, whoever wins the election within each state, the Electoral College chooses that person. But they don't have to. Okay, they don't have to. They always have, but they don't have to. Now, the winner must get a majority of the Electoral College, and that majority would be 270 votes. So, and each state has a specific number of electoral votes that is equal to the number of House of Representative members and the number of Senate members combined. So each state, as we know, has two senators. And each state, even the smallest ones, have at minimum one House of Representatives member. So the minimum number of electoral votes that any state can have is three. Two senators, one House of Representatives member. Now, of course, since House of Representatives is the number of members of the House of Representatives for each state is based on the population of that state. The more populated the state is, the more House of Representative members they have, therefore the more electoral college votes they have. So California has the most electoral college votes. Texas has a lot. New York has a lot because they are the most populated states. Florida, the smaller states, Wyoming, Montana, Rhode Island, they have fewer electoral votes because they have fewer House of Representative members because they have smaller population. So the way it works is except for a few minor exceptions, it's a winner take all system. It means whoever wins the state of Texas between the candidates for president, that candidate gets all of the electoral college votes for that state. So they could win by one vote and they get all the votes in the electoral college. So criticisms of this, it is possible to not win the popular vote and win the electoral vote. You can have more people in America vote for the loser, yet that person doesn't win because they didn't win the big states. They didn't win the larger states with the most electoral college votes. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how many American citizens voted for which presidential candidate. All that matters is which presidential candidate won which states. Uh, and we'll look at the electoral college map here in a minute. Congressional elections. Um, there's something called an incumbency advantage. The incumbent is the sitting congressperson who's running for re-election, and incumbents win 80 to 90% of the time. It's difficult for a challenger to win a congressional election. And this incumbency advantage includes staff support. You've got people working for you, paid for with tax dollars, to help you uh, do your job well. Your median travel is paid for, so you can go back and forth to your home district and without having to pay for it yourself. And campaign, you can redistricting, which is the changing of the congressional districts, can be the shape of the congressional district when it's changed in redistricting can be reshaped to benefit a sitting congressperson. And all of these things give you, especially the median travel, give you name recognition. It reminds people of who you are, and any challenger is going to know this, that they have a 10 to 20% chance of winning and an 80 to 90% chance of losing. A challenger does, so that's going to scare most of them off, and that has a scare off effect. Countervailing forces that might cause an incumbent to lose, they can also be redistricted out of their seat. The district could be redrawn in such a way that they lose support. Scandal, marital infidelities, bribes, anything like that can cause a sitting congressman to lose their elections. Presidential coattails. If the presidential winner in an election is of the opposing party of a sitting congressman, it's very possible that that sitting congressman will lose to the opponent that's of the same party as the president, and that means that that opponent has ridden the presidential coattails into office. And then midterm elections, usually uh, incumbents lose, especially the presidential party's incumbents lose uh, seats in the midterm elections. And the midterm elections are those elections that fall between the presidential elections. So you have a presidential election in 2012. We're going to have another one in 2016. This year, 2014, we're going to have midterm elections where we'll basically elect all the people that we normally elect, governors and members of Congress, only not the president. Okay, here's the 2012, the last most recent presidential election, the electoral college breakdown. How many electoral votes each state has? Uh, California 55, they have the most. Texas second with 38, and then you have Florida and New York with 29. And those are the big boys. And then you have some of the smaller ones like Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. They have the minimum, 3. Alaska. So the goal is to win uh, enough states and accumulate enough electoral votes to get a majority of all of them. And so you focus your attention on the larger ones if you think you can win it. If you don't think you can win a large state, you don't waste your money. Democratic presidential candidates usually don't spend any money in Texas, or very little, because they know they can't win. Texas is a very conservative state, usually votes Republican. The opposite is true for California. Republicans generally don't, presidential candidates don't spend a lot of money and time in California because California is a very democratic state and they don't have a very good chance of winning it. So what they do is they focus their money and attention on what's called toss-up states. Uh, States like Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, these bigger states that it's each election it can be go to a different party. It's very evenly split. And here's just an electoral map showing how the 2012 presidential election played out. As you can see, the South and the Middle America is red. Therefore, that those states, those electoral votes went to Republican candidate Mitt Romney in the 2012 election. The blue states concentrated in the West and the Northeast, and then what was known as the Rust Belt, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, those areas. Those states went to uh, President Obama, who was running for re-election, in Florida. Florida is really the pivotal state, but anyway, it just shows how the nation is kind of broken up into Democrat and Republican sections, if you will.